He would kill more people than any human being before the 20th century, perhaps 17 million souls, 5% of the world's entire population, erased by his armies in a lifetime of conquest. Cities that had flourished for centuries would become charnel houses, their streets piled with corpses, their walls decorated with towers of skulls. From Delhi to Damascus, from the Volga to the Ganges, the mere mention of his name would send populations fleeing in terror. And it all began in a small town on the fringes of a dying empire, where a boy was born who would reshape the world through slaughter. Timur came into the world in April 1336, in or near the town of Kaish, modern Shahrisabz, in the region of Transoxiana, the land between the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers in what is now Uzbekistan. The place of his birth lay in the shadow of Samarkand, one of the great cities of the Silk Road. But Timur was not born to urban splendor. His people were the Barlas, a clan of Turkic-Mongol heritage who traced their lineage back to the warriors of Genghis Khan, but who had, over the generations, settled into a semi-nomadic existence on the Central Asian steppe. His father, Taragai, was a minor chief, respected within the clan, but commanding no great power beyond it. The Barlas were one clan among many in a fractured political landscape where no single authority held sway. The world Timur entered was a world of competing warlords, shifting alliances and endemic violence, where survival depended on reading the intentions of rivals and responding with speed and ruthlessness. A century and a half earlier, this region had been the heart of the Mongol world empire. Genghis Khan's descendants had divided his conquests among themselves, and Transoxiana had fallen to the Chagatai Khanate, named for Genghis's second son. For generations, the Chagatai Khans had ruled from Samarkand and its surrounding territories, maintaining at least nominal unity over the vast lands between Persia and China. By the time of Timur's birth, that unity was a memory. The Chagatai Khanate had split into western and eastern portions, and even within the western half, which included Transoxiana, real power had fragmented among tribal chiefs who paid lip service to Chinggisid princes while pursuing their own ambitions. The death of Khan Kazan in 1346, when Timur was 10 years old, accelerated the collapse. The Khanate dissolved into civil war, with rival factions backing different puppet Khans, while the actual fighting was done by tribal armies, whose loyalties shifted with the political winds. This was the school in which Timur received his education. He grew up among horsemen and warriors, learning to ride before he could walk, to shoot from the saddle, to survive on the steppe where weakness meant death. The Barlas valued the skills that had made their Mongol ancestors masters of the world: mobility, endurance, discipline, and the capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence. Timur absorbed these lessons in his bones. He also watched the endless political maneuvering of the chiefs, the alliances made and broken, the betrayals punished and rewarded, the calculation that underlay every gesture of friendship or submission. He developed qualities that would serve him throughout his life: patience that could wait years for the right moment, memory that forgot no slight and no favor, ambition that concealed itself behind apparent loyalty until the time came to strike. Those who met him in these early years noted his intelligence, his physical courage, and a certain coldness in his gaze that suggested depths not easily fathomed. He was not yet a great man, but he was becoming a dangerous one. The chaos of Transoxiana offered opportunities to those bold enough to seize them. By his early 20s, Timur had begun participating in the region's endemic warfare, serving various chiefs as a minor commander, building a reputation for bravery and tactical skill. He was not yet leading armies, but he was learning how armies worked, how men could be motivated through fear and reward, how terrain could be exploited, how enemies could be divided and destroyed piecemeal. During these years of obscure conflict, Timur suffered the injury that would mark him for life. The details vary in different accounts. Some say he was wounded in battle, others that he was shot while stealing sheep, a less heroic but perhaps more plausible origin. What seems certain is that arrows struck his right leg and right hand, leaving permanent damage. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, and his right arm would remain partially disabled. His enemies called him Timur Elang, Timur the Lame, a mockery that the Western world would eventually transform into Tamerlane. He embraced the name as others have embraced their scars, transforming an insult into an identity. The lame man would outride, outfight, and outlast every able-bodied rival who thought his disability made him weak. By 1360, Timur was still a minor figure, one warlord among many, in a land that produced warlords the way other lands produced wheat. He commanded the loyalty of a few hundred fighters, controlled no significant territory, and answered to chiefs more powerful than himself. Nothing in his position suggested that he would become anything more than a successful bandit, or at best, a regional strongman of modest importance. But the chaos that had shaped him was about to deepen, and in chaos, Timur had learned, lay opportunity. The fractured world of the post-Mongol steppe was waiting for someone to reassemble it, someone with the vision to see what was possible and the ruthlessness to make it real. Timur had both, and his rise was about to begin. The opportunity came wrapped in catastrophe. In 1360, a warlord named Tuglug Timur swept into Transoxiana from the eastern Chagatai territories, claiming authority over the fragmented Khanate and demanding submission from the local chiefs. The Barlas leader fled rather than submit, leaving his clan without direction. Into this vacuum stepped Timur, now in his mid-20s, who made a calculation that would define his political method for the rest of his life. He submitted. While other chiefs resisted and were destroyed, Timur bent the knee to Tuglu Timur, accepted a position in the invaders' administration, and waited. Submission was not surrender. It was strategy. By serving the conqueror, Timur preserved his forces, gained access to the inner workings of power, and positioned himself to exploit whatever weaknesses emerged. He was learning to survive among enemies, to smile while calculating, to appear useful while remaining dangerous. The arrangement did not last. Tuglug Timur's son, appointed to govern Transoxiana, proved both brutal and incompetent, a combination that generated resistance without inspiring fear. Timur quietly withdrew his support, slipping away to join the growing coalition of chiefs who preferred independence to submission. Among these rebels, he found the man who would become his most important ally, and eventually his most dangerous rival, Amir Hussein. Hussein was the grandson of a powerful regional lord and commanded resources that Timur, at this stage, could not match. The two men needed each other. Timur's tactical brilliance and growing band of followers complemented Hussein's wealth and political connections. They sealed their alliance through marriage. Timur wed Hussein's sister, binding their fates together with blood ties that were supposed to guarantee loyalty. Together, they fought. The years between 1360 and 1366 were a chaos of battles, sieges, betrayals, and narrow escapes. Timur and Hussein won victories and suffered defeats, built armies and lost them. controlled cities, and were driven from them. At one point, they were reduced to a handful of followers, hunted men hiding in the marshes and deserts of the region. At another, they commanded forces capable of challenging any rival in Transoxiana. Through it all, Timur demonstrated the qualities that would make him legendary. He could endure hardship that broke other men: hunger, thirst, wounds, the death of companions. He could inspire loyalty in followers who had every reason to abandon a cause that often seemed hopeless. He could read a battlefield with an intuition that bordered on prescience, sensing weakness before it became visible, striking where enemies least expected. And he could be ruthless with a cold efficiency that made his mercy, when he offered it, seem all the more valuable. By 1366, the tide had turned. Tughluq Timur was dead. His son had been driven from Transoxiana, and the eastern Chagatai threat had receded. Timur and Hussein emerged as the dominant powers in the region, their alliance having survived years of shared hardship. They divided authority between them, cooperating in the conquest of remaining rivals, while each quietly building strength for the confrontation both knew was coming. The partnership could not last. Two ambitious men sharing power is an inherently unstable arrangement, and both Timur and Hussein understood that Transoxiana could have only one master. The question was which of them it would be. Timur worked methodically to ensure the answer. He cultivated relationships with chiefs who chafed under Hussein's arrogance, offering them respect where Hussein offered only demands. He demonstrated generosity to followers, sharing plunder and glory in ways that built personal loyalty. He married additional wives from influential families, weaving a web of alliances that gave him supporters across the region. And he watched, with the patience he had learned in his years of struggle, for the moment when Hussein's position would become vulnerable. The break came in 1370. The immediate cause was a dispute over policy. Hussein wanted to move the capital to Balkh, where his own power base lay, while Timur insisted on Samarkand. But the real issue was simpler. The alliance had served its purpose, and now one partner had to eliminate the other. Timur moved first. He rallied his supporters, declared his grievances against Hussein's tyranny, and marched on Balkh, where his former brother-in-law had taken refuge. The siege was short. Hussein's support melted away, as chiefs calculated which side was likely to win and adjusted their loyalties accordingly. When Balkh fell, Hussein was captured and brought before the man he had once treated as a junior partner. Timur did not kill him personally. That task was left to others who had their own grievances, men whose relatives Hussein had executed, whose honor he had offended. Timur merely permitted the vengeance, keeping his own hands technically clean, while ensuring that no rival remained alive to challenge his supremacy. It was a method he would employ again and again, letting others do the bloody work while he preserved the appearance of reluctant necessity. With Hussein dead, Timur was the undisputed master of Transoxiana, but he faced a problem that would shadow his entire reign. He was not a Chinggisid. The mystique of Genghis Khan's bloodline remained powerful across the steppe world, and only descendants of the great conqueror could legitimately claim the title of Khan. Timur, for all his victories, was merely a tribal chief who had risen through talent rather than birth. His solution was characteristically clever. He installed puppet Khans, genuine Chinggisids who held the title while Timur held the power, and ruled in their name. He married Sarai Mulk Khanum, a Chinggisid princess and Hussein's widow, which entitled him to call himself Gurgan, royal son-in-law, connecting him to the sacred lineage without falsely claiming it as his own. The arrangement satisfied tradition while leaving real authority exactly where Timur wanted it, in his own hands. In 1370, Timur was 34 years old. He controlled Transoxiana, commanded an army hardened by a decade of warfare, and had eliminated every rival capable of challenging his position. He had risen from minor chieftain to regional sovereign through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. It was enough to make most men content. For Timur, it was merely the beginning. The conquests began almost immediately. Timur understood that an army forged in civil war needed foreign enemies to remain cohesive. The warriors who had followed him through years of struggle expected rewards: land, plunder, glory. And if he could not provide them through expansion, they would seek other leaders who could. Moreover, the fragmented states surrounding Transoxiana offered opportunities that a man of his ambition could not ignore. The post-Mongol world was a shattered mirror, and Timur intended to reassemble the pieces under his own reflection. Khwarezm fell first. The wealthy oasis region south of the Aral Sea had been a persistent rival to whoever controlled Transoxiana, and Timur launched repeated campaigns to subdue it. The fighting was brutal. Khwarezm resisted stubbornly, and Timur responded with escalating severity. When the city of Urgench finally fell after prolonged resistance, he ordered it demolished so thoroughly that crops were planted over its ruins. The population was scattered, the walls razed, the very memory of resistance erased from the landscape. The pattern established at Urgench would repeat across a continent. Cities that submitted promptly received relatively lenient treatment: tribute, hostages, acknowledgement of Timur's supremacy, but survival. Cities that resisted faced consequences, calculated to ensure that others would not make the same choice. Timur was not cruel for pleasure, at least not primarily. He was cruel for effect. Terror was a tool wielded as deliberately as any siege engine, designed to break the will of enemies before his armies ever reached their walls. Persia beckoned. The vast Iranian plateau had fragmented into competing dynasties after the collapse of Mongol rule. The Muzaffarids in the south, the Kartids in Herat, the Jalirids in Baghdad and Tabriz, and others whose names have faded from memory. None could match Timur's military strength, but their combined resistance might have posed a serious obstacle. Timur ensured they never had the chance to combine. He struck piecemeal, isolating each target before destroying it. Herat, the great city of Khorasan, fell in 1381 after its Kartid rulers misjudged the balance of power. The Muzaffarids of Shiraz and Isfahan were picked apart over several campaigns, their internal divisions exploited until resistance became impossible. The Jalirids fled westward as Timur's armies approached, abandoning their capitals without a fight. By the mid-1380s, most of Persia acknowledged Timur's authority, either through conquest or preemptive submission. One city's fate became legend. Isfahan, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, had submitted peacefully in 1387, accepting Timur's authority and agreeing to pay tribute. But after his main army departed, the townspeople rose against the garrison he had left behind, slaughtering the soldiers and declaring their independence. It was exactly the kind of defiance Timur could not permit, not because he cared about the dead soldiers, but because unpunished rebellion would invite imitation. He returned to Isfahan with the full weight of his army. What followed was not battle, but butchery. Timur ordered each soldier in his army to bring him a specified number of severed heads. The quotas varied by unit, but the total demanded was staggering. The soldiers spread through the city, killing every man they could find. stacking the heads in pyramids outside the walls as proof of compliance. When the killing was done, towers of skulls rose around Isfahan, 70,000 heads by the lowest estimates, arranged in macabre monuments to the price of resistance. The skull towers became Timur's signature. He would repeat the practice at city after city, varying the numbers, but never the message. The towers served no military purpose. They were pure communication, a statement written in bone that reached every corner of the known world. Rulers from China to Egypt heard the stories and understood. This was not a man who could be defied safely. Submission was survival. Resistance was extinction. Yet the same hands that built skull towers also built mosques. Samarkand transformed under Timur's patronage into one of the most magnificent cities on earth. He poured the wealth of conquered nations into its construction. Palaces, gardens, madrasas, and monuments that announced his glory to anyone who entered. The Registan, the great public square at the city's heart, began to take the form that still awes visitors today. Craftsmen and architects forcibly relocated from conquered cities, the best that Persia, Syria, and India could produce, labored to create beauty that would outlast the violence that made it possible. Timur saw no contradiction. He was simultaneously patron and destroyer, connoisseur and butcher, a man who could discuss Persian poetry with scholars one day and order the massacre of a city's population the next. This duality was not hypocrisy in any sense he would have recognized. Great rulers built great monuments. Great rulers also punished those who defied them. Both activities were expressions of the same authority, the same vision, the same will imposed upon the world. He administered his conquests with pragmatic efficiency. Governors drawn from his military commanders ruled the major cities, backed by garrisons that ensured compliance. Local elites who accepted Timurid supremacy were often left in place, their knowledge of regional affairs too valuable to discard. Tribute flowed towards Samarkand, funding the endless campaigns and the endless construction, while trade routes that had been disrupted by the conquests gradually reopened under the enforced peace of Timurid rule. By 1387, Timur controlled an empire stretching from the borders of Anatolia to the frontiers of India, from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush. He was 51 years old, in the prime of his powers, commanding resources that no ruler between China and Egypt could match. The boy from Kaish had become the master of Central Asia and Persia, heir to the Mongol legacy in everything but blood. And he was not finished. The western lands still beckoned, the Caucasus, the Golden Horde, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. Timur turned his armies toward new horizons, new enemies, new towers yet to be built. The betrayal came from someone Timur had made. Toktamish had been a refugee prince of the Golden Horde, driven from his homeland by rivals and seeking shelter wherever he could find it. Timur had taken him in, provided him with troops and resources, and helped him fight his way back to power. By 1381, Toktamish ruled the Golden Horde, the vast Mongol successor state that dominated the Eurasian steppe from the Urals to the borders of Poland. He owed everything to Timur's patronage. He repaid it with war. The reasons were both personal and structural. Toktamish was ambitious, and he chafed at the subordinate position his debt to Timur implied. More practically, the two empires' spheres of influence were colliding in the Caucasus and Azerbaijan, where both claimed authority over the same territories and the same trade routes. Two predators cannot share the same hunting ground indefinitely. By the late 1380s, Toktamish was raiding Timurid territory, testing the borders, asserting his independence from the man who had made him Khan. Timur's response was delayed by circumstances, rebellions in Persia, campaigns in other directions, the constant demands of holding together an empire built on conquest. But he did not forget. Tokhtamish's betrayal joined the long list of grievances that Timur's remarkable memory preserved, waiting for the moment when accounts could be settled. That moment came in 1391. Timur assembled one of the largest armies of his career and marched north into the steppe, pursuing Tokhtamish into the heart of Golden Horde territory. The campaign was a logistical nightmare. Hundreds of miles of grassland with no cities to plunder, no fortresses to capture, only the endless horizon and an enemy who refused to stand and fight. Tokhtamish understood that his cavalry could not match Timur's veterans in pitched battle, so he retreated, trading space for time, hoping that distance and supply problems would accomplish what his warriors could not. Timur pressed on regardless. His army marched for months, sustained by careful preparation and iron discipline, following Tokhtamish deep into the Russian steppe. Finally, at the Kondurcha River in June 1391, the Golden Horde turned to fight. The battle was enormous, perhaps 100,000 warriors on each side, two of the largest cavalry armies the medieval world had ever seen clashing across miles of open grassland. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, charges and countercharges sweeping back and forth, the steppe trembling beneath the hooves of 250,000 horses. Then Timur's discipline told. His formations held where Tokhtamish's began to fragment, his reserves committed at precisely the right moment. The Golden Horde broke and fled, Tokhtamish barely escaping with his life. It was a victory, but not a decisive one. Tokhtamish survived, rebuilt his forces, and within 2 years was raiding Timurid territory again. The steppe was too vast, the nomadic populations too mobile, for a single battle to settle anything permanently. Timur would have to do it again. In 1395, he did. This time, Timur was determined to finish the job. He invaded Golden Horde territory with overwhelming force, caught Tokhtamish at the Terek River in the Caucasus, and destroyed his army so completely that the Khan fled westward and never threatened Timurid lands again. But Timur did not stop with battlefield victory. He pursued the destruction of the Golden Horde itself. His armies swept across the steppe, burning cities, scattering populations, annihilating the economic infrastructure that sustained nomadic power. Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital on the lower Volga, one of the largest cities in the world, a cosmopolitan trading center where merchants from Europe, Asia, and Africa had mingled for generations, was sacked and left in ruins. The great trade routes that had enriched the Horde were deliberately disrupted, their caravans scattered, their profits redirected toward Timurid-controlled alternatives. The Golden Horde never recovered. It would linger for another century as a diminished, fragmented power, but its dominance over the Eurasian steppe was finished. The state that had terrorized Russia for 200 years, that had extracted tribute from princes who would later call themselves Tsars, had been broken by Timur's vengeance. Moscow's eventual rise to power owed something to this destruction. With the Horde weakened, Russian princes had room to consolidate that would not have existed otherwise. Between the great steppe campaigns, Timur ravaged the lands in between. Georgia, Christian and defiant, suffered repeated invasions that devastated its population and shattered its political unity. Armenia was plundered, its ancient communities scattered. The cities of Azerbaijan changed hands repeatedly as Timur asserted control over the critical corridor between Persia and the Caucasus. The campaigns of these years, sometimes called Timur's 5-year campaign were among the most destructive in human history. Entire regions were depopulated, their inhabitants killed or fled, their cities reduced to ruins that would take generations to rebuild. Timur moved through the western lands like a force of nature, leaving desolation in his wake, his passage marked by the skull towers that had become his signature. His fame spread to the edges of the known world. European kingdoms heard of the terrible conqueror in the east and wondered whether he might be the legendary Prester John, a Christian king come to destroy the enemies of the faith. A hope that revealed more about European desperation than about Timur, who was no Christian and no savior. The Ming court in China received reports of his conquests and began to worry about their western frontiers. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, rulers who had never heard of Transoxiana now knew the name of its master. Samarkand swelled with the spoils of victory. Wealth flowed in from every direction: gold, silver, gems, silks, slaves, and the skilled artisans who would transform raw plunder into lasting beauty. The city that Timur was building had become the symbolic center of a world empire, a statement in architecture and urban planning that he had achieved what even Genghis Khan had not: dominion over both the settled lands and the steppe. By 1395, Timur was 59 years old. He had campaigned almost continuously for 25 years, his body bearing the accumulated damage of wounds, hardship, and the simple wear of decades in the saddle. But his ambition remained undimmed. The West had been conquered. Now he looked south toward the fabled wealth of India, and east toward the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The greatest campaigns of his life were still ahead. India had haunted the imagination of Central Asian conquerors for centuries. Beyond the mountain passes lay wealth beyond calculation: the accumulated treasures of Hindu temples, the legendary riches of Delhi's sultans, a subcontinent so vast and so populous that even partial conquest promised rewards sufficient to fund empires. Timur's predecessors had dreamed of India. He would make the dream a nightmare. The justification, as always, was pious. The sultans of Delhi were Muslims, but they had grown lax, tolerating Hindu practices, failing to enforce proper religious observance, allowing infidels to flourish under their rule. Timur would correct these failures. He would bring true Islam to India at sword's point, punishing the impious and claiming the wealth that rightfully belonged to a proper defender of the faith. That this justification masked simple greed fooled no one, but it provided the religious legitimacy that Timur, for all his brutality, always sought. In 1398, his army crossed the Hindu Kush and descended into the Punjab. The approach to Delhi was marked by the usual Timurid methods. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Populations that fled were hunted down. Skull towers rose at intervals to mark the conqueror's passage. But India presented a problem Timur had not faced before: what to do with the vast numbers of prisoners his forces accumulated as they advanced. His solution was characteristically ruthless. On the eve of battle against Sultan Mahmud Shah Tughlaq's army, Timur held perhaps 100,000 Indian captives, Hindus mostly, taken in the campaign's early stages. They represented a potential threat if battle went badly. They would need to be fed and guarded if battle went well. Timur ordered them killed. In a single day, his soldiers slaughtered 100,000 bound and helpless prisoners, clearing the decks for the engagement ahead. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. The Delhi Sultanate had been weakened by decades of internal strife, and its army, though it included war elephants that might have terrified less experienced troops, was no match for Timur's veterans. The Sultanate's forces broke and fled. Sultan Mahmud escaped into the hinterland, and Delhi lay open before the conqueror. The sack of Delhi lasted 15 days. Timur's soldiers spread through one of the world's great cities, taking everything of value they could carry and destroying much of what they could not. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Muslims died alongside Hindus, the innocent alongside those who had resisted, women and children alongside warriors. Fires consumed entire districts. The stench of death hung over the city for months afterward. When Timur finally departed, he left behind a ruin that would take a century to recover. He also left with treasure beyond counting: gold, silver, gems, textiles, and elephants. 130 of them, trained for war and display, accompanied his army back across the mountains. The wealth of India flowed towards Samarkand, funding the construction projects that Timur never ceased to commission. The great Bibi Khanim Mosque, intended to be the largest in the Islamic world, rose from foundations laid with Indian plunder. Timur was building a monument to eternity with stones mortared in blood. He did not rest. Within 2 years of returning from India, he was marching west again, this time against the Mamluk Sultanate that ruled Egypt and Syria. The Mamluks were formidable, slave soldiers who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and built a military culture around constant training and fierce discipline. But they were also distant from their Syrian provinces, and those provinces were vulnerable. Aleppo fell in 1400, its citadel, one of the most impressive fortifications in the medieval world, proving unable to resist Timurid siegecraft. The skull towers rose again, this time built from Syrian heads. Damascus followed, surrendering after negotiation, but suffering nonetheless when Timur's soldiers sacked portions of the city despite the terms of capitulation. The artisans of Damascus, famous for their metalwork and textiles, were rounded up and shipped to Samarkand, their skills conscripted for the glory of the conqueror. During the siege of Damascus, Timur met one of the greatest minds of the medieval world. Ibn Khaldun, the North African scholar, whose writings on history and sociology would influence thinkers for centuries, had been in the city and found himself trapped by the siege. He sought an audience with Timur, partly to secure safe passage, partly out of genuine curiosity about the man who had shaken the world. The two spoke for weeks. Timur questioned Ibn Khaldun about North Africa, about the Maghreb's rulers and geography, about anything that might feed his endless appetite for information. Ibn Khaldun, in turn, observed the conqueror with a scholar's eye, later recording his impressions of a man who was highly intelligent and very perspicacious, addicted to debate and argumentation about what he knows, and also about what he does not know. The encounter between the philosopher and the destroyer was one of history's strangest meetings, two titans of their respective domains, one building knowledge, the other building ruins. Baghdad fell in 1401. The city that had once been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic civilization at its height, had never fully recovered from its destruction by the Mongols in 1258. Now Timur completed what Hulagu had begun. The city was sacked, its remaining population massacred, skull towers constructed from the heads of its citizens. The message was consistent. No city was too ancient, too holy, or too famous to escape punishment for resistance. By 1402, Timur's empire had reached its greatest extent, from the plains of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the frozen steppe of Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Territories acknowledged his supremacy or trembled at his approach. He was 65 years old, his body failing from decades of war, but his ambition burned as hot as ever. one great power remained unbroken: the Ottoman Empire. The Turks, who had burst from Anatolia to conquer the Balkans and besiege Constantinople, represented the rising force of the Islamic world. Their Sultan, Bayezid I, styled himself the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns. He had crushed a crusading army at Nicopolis in 1396 and now pressed the siege of Constantinople itself, threatening to extinguish the last remnant of the Roman Empire. Bayezid and Timur had exchanged letters, each demanding submission from the other, each insulting the other's lineage and legitimacy, each making clear that the Islamic world was not large enough for two supreme conquerors. The collision that had been building for years was about to occur. Two empires, two conquerors. One would break. The insults had been escalating for years. Bayezid called Timur an upstart, a lame dog unworthy of the title he claimed. Timur called Bayezid a petty frontier chieftain, drunk on minor victories against Christian weaklings. Each demanded the other's submission. Each knew submission was impossible. The letters that passed between them were performances for their respective courts, building the case for a war that both considered inevitable. The immediate cause was Anatolia's patchwork of small states, many of them ruled by Turkish princes, whom Bayezid had dispossessed in his consolidation of Ottoman power. These refugees fled to Timur's court, begging for restoration, offering their knowledge of Ottoman weaknesses in exchange for his support. Timur collected them like weapons, promising aid he had every intention of providing, once the time was right. By 1402, the time was right. Timur had secured his other frontiers, amassed an army that contemporaries estimated at 140,000 men, and prepared for the campaign that would determine supremacy over the Islamic world. He marched into Anatolia in the spring, bypassing the fortresses Bayezid expected him to besiege, moving with the speed that had always been his advantage. Bayezid was forced to abandon his siege of Constantinople and race eastward to meet the threat. The Ottoman army was formidable, perhaps 85,000 men, including the elite Janissary infantry and heavy cavalry that had crushed the cream of European chivalry at Nicopolis. Bayezid had never lost a major battle. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, convinced him that this campaign would end like all the others, with his enemies broken and his legend enhanced. The armies met near Ankara on July 20th, 1402. Timur had chosen his ground carefully. He positioned his forces near water sources and ensured his troops were rested, while Bayezid's men arrived exhausted from their forced march across Anatolia. The Sultan had been outmaneuvered before the first arrow flew, a characteristic Timurid approach that sought victory through preparation rather than heroics. The battle began with the usual cavalry skirmishes, each side testing the other's strength, probing for weaknesses. Then came the moment that decided everything. The Tatar cavalry units fighting under Ottoman banners, troops whose ancestors had served the same steppe traditions as Timur's own warriors, began defecting to the Timurid side. They had been subjects of the princes Bayezid had dispossessed, and Timur had spent months cultivating their commanders, promising restoration of their masters, appealing to loyalties that transcended Ottoman authority. The defections shattered the Ottoman formation. What had been a coherent battle line became chaos as units switched sides or simply fled. The Janissaries fought on with suicidal courage, forming a defensive ring around their sultan, but they were infantry surrounded by cavalry on an open plain. One by one, they fell. By nightfall, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Bayezid himself was captured, dragged from the chaos by Timurid soldiers, the thunderbolt reduced to a prisoner awaiting his conqueror's pleasure. Later legend claimed that Timur kept Bayezid in an iron cage, displaying him like an animal, forcing him to watch his favorite wife served naked at Timurid banquets. The story is almost certainly false. Contemporary sources describe Bayezid's captivity as uncomfortable but not degrading, more house arrest than exhibition. But the legend captured something true about the reversal of fortune. The Sultan who had terrorized Europe was now utterly helpless, his empire shattered, his person subject to the whims of a man he had dismissed as a crippled barbarian. Bayezid died in captivity in March 1403, probably from natural causes accelerated by despair. He was 53 years old and had ruled for 14 years. His sons immediately began fighting among themselves for the fragments of Ottoman power, inaugurating a civil war that would last a decade. The empire that had seemed poised to conquer Constantinople and dominate the eastern Mediterranean had been thrown back a generation by a single afternoon's battle. The consequences for Europe were profound, though Europeans barely understood them at the time. Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, besieged by Bayezid's forces when Timur invaded Anatolia, received a reprieve that would last 50 years. The city that should have fallen in 1402 or 1403 survived until 1453. Its final decades, a strange afterlife granted by a conqueror who had no interest in saving Christianity but saved it nonetheless. European rulers watched these events with a mixture of awe and terror. Embassies arrived at Timur's court from as far as Castile. Ruy González de Clavijo led a Spanish delegation that reached Samarkand in 1404 and left a detailed account of what they found. They saw a court of unimaginable splendor, tent cities that covered miles, wealth flowing in from 3 continents, and a ruler who received their credentials with courtesy while making clear that he considered their masters insignificant. Clavijo's report circulated through European courts, feeding both fascination and fear about the power that had emerged in the East. Timur was now 66 years old, and he stood at the zenith of human power. No ruler on earth commanded comparable resources. No army could challenge him in the field. From the Mediterranean to the Ganges, from the Arctic steppe to the Persian Gulf, his word was law and his anger was death. He had defeated every enemy, conquered every rival, built an empire that dwarfed anything seen since the height of Mongol power a century and a half before. For most men, this would have been enough. Timur was not most men. Even as he savored his triumph over Bayezid, his mind was turning eastward toward the final conquest that would complete his legacy. The Ming dynasty ruled China, the wealthiest, most populous empire on earth, a prize that had eluded even Genghis Khan in his lifetime. The Ming emperors had sent embassies to Timur, demanding tribute, treating him as a subordinate in the traditional Chinese manner. The insult rankled. It demanded answer. Timur began preparing for the invasion of China. The scale of his ambition had never been greater. Timur assembled an army of 200,000 men, the largest force he had ever commanded, provisioned for a campaign across thousands of miles of steppe and desert. The logistics alone required years of preparation. Supply depots established along the route, fodder stockpiled for hundreds of thousands of horses, weapons and siege equipment manufactured in quantities that strained even his empire's vast resources. This would not be a raid or a punitive expedition. This would be the conquest of the world's greatest civilization, the final proof that Timur had surpassed even Genghis Khan. In the winter of 1404 to 1405, the army began its march eastward from Samarkand. The route would take them through the frozen steppes of Central Asia, across deserts where armies had perished before, into territories that had defeated invaders for millennia. Timur knew the dangers. He was 68 years old, his body ravaged by decades of wounds and hardship, carried in a litter when he could no longer ride. But his will drove him forward. He had never abandoned a campaign, never accepted limits, never acknowledged that anything was beyond his reach. The cold was savage. Even by the standards of Central Asian winters, the season of 1404 to 1405 was brutal, temperatures plunging far below freezing, snow burying the landscape in white silence. The army pressed on regardless, Timur commanding from his litter, refusing to halt despite conditions that killed men and horses by the hundreds. At Otrar, a city on the Jaxartes River, the march stopped. Timur had fallen ill, fever, perhaps pneumonia, his weakened body finally succumbing to the punishment he had inflicted on it for nearly 7 decades. Physicians attended him, but 16th century medicine could do little against infection in an elderly man already exhausted by years of war. On February 18th, 1405, Timur died. His last words, according to some accounts, concerned the campaign he would never complete. "Do not weep. Proceed as I have commanded." Whether authentic or invented, the sentiment captured something essential about the man. Even in death, he was issuing orders, expecting obedience, refusing to acknowledge that anything, even mortality, could thwart his designs. The army turned back. The invasion of China, which might have reshaped the history of Asia, died with the man who had conceived it. The Ming dynasty, unaware of how close they had come to facing the most devastating military force of the age, continued its rule for another 2.5 centuries. Timur's final ambition remained forever unfulfilled. They carried his body back to Samarkand, to the Gur-e-Amir, the tomb of the king, a mausoleum he had originally built for his grandson, but which now received its true occupant. The structure still stands, its ribbed azure dome rising above the city Timur had transformed from a provincial town into a world capital. Beneath that dome, in a crypt lined with jade and alabaster, the Conqueror was laid to rest. The empire he had built began fracturing almost immediately. Timur had conquered through personal genius, holding together disparate territories through the force of his will and the terror of his reputation. He had created no institutions capable of surviving his death, no administrative systems that could function without his constant oversight. His sons and grandsons immediately began fighting among themselves, each claiming portions of the inheritance, none capable of commanding the loyalty that their father and grandfather had inspired. The wars of succession lasted years. Eventually, Timur's son, Shah Rukh, emerged as the dominant figure, ruling from Herat rather than Samarkand, and presiding over a realm reduced to Persia and Central Asia, vast territories, but a fraction of what Timur had controlled at his height. The Western conquests slipped away. The Golden Horde's successors reasserted themselves on the steppe. The Ottomans recovered from their civil war and resumed their march toward Constantinople. The empire that had terrified the world dissolved into the same fragmentation from which Timur had originally emerged. Yet something survived beyond the conquests. Shah Rukh and his successors patronized arts and learning with the same enthusiasm Timur had shown, if without his accompanying destruction. Herat became a center of Persian culture, producing poetry, painting, and scholarship that influenced the entire Islamic world. Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg, became one of history's great astronomers, building an observatory at Samarkand, whose measurements of stellar positions remained the most accurate in the world for 2 centuries. The dynasty that had been founded on slaughter ended by nurturing civilization. And in 1483, in the valley of Fergana, a boy was born who would carry Timur's legacy further than anyone could have imagined. Babur was descended from Timur on his father's side and from Genghis Khan on his mother's, the two great conqueror lineages united in a single person. Driven from Central Asia by enemies, Babur eventually made his way to India, where in 1526 he founded an empire that would rule the subcontinent for 3 centuries. He called it the Mughal Empire, Mughal being simply the Persian word for Mongol, but its true inspiration was Timur. Babur revered his ancestor, visited his tomb, modelled his conquests on Timurid precedents. The Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, the glories of Mughal India, all of them traced their lineage back to the lame warlord from Kesh. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened Timur's tomb. They found a skeleton that confirmed what the chronicles had recorded. A tall man, powerfully built, with severe damage to the right leg and right hand, the wounds that had given him his mocking nickname. The facial reconstruction created from his skull showed a man of Mongol features, broad-faced, with traces of red in his hair and beard. For the first time in 5 centuries, the world could see something like the face of the conqueror. The timing of the exhumation spawned its own legend. The tomb was opened on June 19th, 1941. 3 days later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, launching the most destructive war in human history. Locals whispered that a curse had been released, that disturbing Timur's rest had brought catastrophe upon the world. The legend was nonsense, of course, but it captured something true about Timur's reputation. Even in death, he was associated with devastation on a scale that defied ordinary comprehension. The devastation he caused in life remains almost impossible to grasp. Scholars estimate that his campaigns killed 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's entire population at the time. If a comparable proportion died today, it would mean the deaths of 400 million human beings. Cities that had flourished for millennia became graveyards. Entire peoples were scattered, their cultures destroyed, their histories erased. The skull towers that marked his passage were not metaphors, but literal structures, built from the heads of the dead, monuments to a cruelty so systematic that it transcended individual malice and became something like policy. Yet he was also a patron of beauty, a lover of learning, a ruler who debated with philosophers and commissioned masterpieces. The same hands that ordered massacres also ordered the construction of mosques that still inspire awe. The same mind that calculated the logistics of genocide calculated the proportions of domes and minarets. He contained contradictions that no simple judgment can resolve. Monster and visionary, destroyer and builder, the worst and most creative impulses of humanity united in a single terrifying figure. History offers no verdict that does justice to his complexity. He was what he was, a man of extraordinary ability who used that ability to reshape the world through violence on a scale that few have matched and none have exceeded. He dreamed of surpassing Genghis Khan, and in destruction at least, he may have succeeded. He built an empire that collapsed within a generation, and a legacy that endures after 6 centuries. In Samarkand, the Gure Amir still stands. Visitors come from around the world to see the tomb of the man who once made the world tremble. They stand beneath the azure dome, looking down at the dark jade slab that marks where Timur lies, and they try to reconcile the beauty of the monument with the horror of the man it commemorates. There is no reconciliation. There is only the record of what he did, the cities destroyed, the millions killed, the towers of skulls, and the mosques that rose alongside them. Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, the conqueror who terrified the world. He had wanted to be remembered. He is.